I'm with Stuart Orme, curator of the Cromwell Museum, and we're standing outside it. But before we go in, it's actually worth taking note of some of the things in Huntingdon.
Yeah, I mean, Huntingdon is a lovely little market town, obviously once the county town of the old county of Huntingdonshire, which was separate from the rest of Cambridgeshire up until 1974, of course. And Huntingdon today, if you visit it, is really one long street. The reason being that for most of its history, that was the busiest road in England. That's Ermine Street, the Great North Road. And in fact, the A1 ran right through the middle of Huntingdon still till the 1970s when we were bypassed. As you can see with just looking across the square, the gap between the museum and the parish church there is a little narrow. So trying to get two lorries past each other must have been interesting. So it was known as Congestion Alley in the 70s.
So on the south side of the river, the Great Ouse, is Godmanchester.
Yeah.
You pronounce it Godmanchester, not Gumster?
Some people like pronounce it Gumster, but Godmanchester, yes. So Godmanchester is actually the older of the two settlements. As you might gather from its name, that's where there was a Roman fort originally and then a Roman township with a mansio, which was basically a Roman government travelodge, effectively. So in the days when this was Ermine Street coming through the town, that was obviously servicing the needs of travellers. By the Anglo-Saxon period, the focus of the local settlement moves this side of the river to Huntingdon. And so you get a Norman castle that's built down by the riverside, and you can see the remains of that in Castle Hills Park, which was originally a Norman Motte and Bailey castle that's well preserved. You can see some elements of that. Unfortunately, the Earl of Huntingdon decided to support the rebels against King Henry II. And in 1174, the castle was laid siege to by King Henry, who ordered it, once he'd taken the castle, pulled down and slighted. So today there's only the earthworks of that survive. We have the 14th century bridge across the river, which is beautiful and of course is still the main bridge for traffic between Godmanchester and Huntingdon today. A couple of things with that which are of interest, as well as its age. One is that the first Battle of Huntingdon was fought on there in 1381, when during the Peasants' Revolts there was an attempt to storm Huntingdon by the poll tax rebels. And the local MP, in fact the first recorded MP for Huntingdon, William Whiteman, galvanised the local townspeople to defend the town in the name of the King, Richard II. They fought off the poll tax rebels and indeed managed to grab two of the ringleaders who they dragged here onto the cathedral, onto the main town square, and had summarily beheaded, for which Whiteman was awarded a pension of sixpence a day for the King for the rest of his life. If you walk across on the footbridge, you'll notice the archway, next to last archway on the Godmanchester side, is differently shaped to all the others. And the reason being this is during the Civil War in the 1640s, that section was taken out in order to control access across the bridge and a drawbridge put in instead. That sort of thing happened quite commonly during the Civil War to fortify towns. A couple of years after Huntingdon, St Ives did something similar with its medieval town bridge.
At that point, the MP for this constituency...
Well, he wasn't the MP here. He had been previously, but he was now MP for Cambridge, and that, of course, was Huntingdon's most famous, some might say infamous son, Oliver Cromwell.
Right.
And he was born here in Huntingdon in 1599. He lived here for over half his life, and even though he'd moved on first to St Ives and then to Ely, he came back to Huntingdon regularly. And it's significant that when the Civil War broke out, he came here and raised his first troop of cavalry to fight for Parliament right here on the town square, in fact in the archway just behind you of what is today the Falcon Pub. Then it was known as either the Boar's Head or the Three Cups. We're not quite sure. It had a different name, but you can still see it's a well-preserved late 16th century courtyard pub.
And well used.
It is, yes. Does the best real ale in the town, even today. But you can see many of the historic features. Yeah. And just to the left of it there, those buildings with the blue frontages, that's where in the next 5 years the Cromwell Museum will be moving to. We've just acquired that for our expansion project.
Actually, yes, so that pub, mild pub of the year. I'm assuming that's down to the drink.
It is, yes. Mild the drink, as in opposed to mild whatever otherwise. But we've got here this lovely historic town square, which of course was in the market square throughout much of its history. Still, of course, markets held here on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Lovely All Saints Church just across the road from there. Which is where both Cromwell's father and grandfather are buried. We have this lovely war memorial here with the rather unusual thinking soldier, which was erected in 1923. And the lovely story behind that statue is that it's entirely down to women. The campaign to create the war memorial here was by the newly created Women's Institute branch in Huntingdon in 1921, led by their president, Lady Montague. And they not only got the idea for the War Memorial, they raised all the funds for it. Lady Montagu got her friend Kathleen Falcon Scott, who was the noted sculptor, to produce the rather striking sculpture you can see on the top.
It does give a bit of a Rodin pose, doesn't it? The thinker. Is that intentional or not sure?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, it's known as the thinking soldier. And of course, Kathleen Scott is also known to history in the fact that she was the widow of Scott of the Antarctic. So there's all sorts of historical connections with that. So it was unveiled in 1923, and of course, a year or two ago had its centenary. And it was lovely to have for that representatives from all the local WI branches, from the current Lady Montagu and also from the Scott family as well.
So you're mentioning these families, so we're talking about the Cromwell family. Now, so Oliver Cromwell, but there are previous Cromwells, and probably he was related to Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah, so Thomas was Oliver's great-great-granduncle, effectively. So obviously he was the chief minister and hatchet man to King Henry VIII back in the mid-1500s. Thomas Cromwell had an older sister called Catherine, who married a Welsh merchant or lawyer called Morgan Williams. Their son Richard Williams went to court as a teenager and acted as the illustrious uncle, secretary and general dog's body. If you've read Wolf Hall or seen the film TV versions of it, you'll see Richard Williams is a significant character. And sometime in the 1530s, at the time that Thomas Cromwell was at the height of his powers, Richard Williams changed his name in honour of his uncle and became Richard Cromwell. Even though Thomas, of course, fell from power in 1540 and got his head cut off, Richard stays at court. He fights for King Henry VIII in France. He's given a knighthood, and he's rewarded with lands here in Huntingdonshire, including the site of a former nunnery at Hinchinbrook on the outskirts of Huntingdon, which he starts turning into a grand mansion. So that's how the Cromwells came to Huntingdon. That property was completed by his son Sir Henry, who was the most wealthy man in the county and who entertained Elizabeth I at Hinchinbrook in 1564. And then, unfortunately, the property was lost by his son, Oliver Cromwell's uncle, who went by the same name. He was Sir Oliver Cromwell. Sir Oliver had a cunning way to try and make his way in the world. So in 1603, when James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England, travelling from Scotland to London, he, of course, has to come through Huntingdon on the Great North Road. And Sir Oliver offers him a bed for the night at Hinchinbrook and lavishly entertains him, gives him a gift of a beautifully bejewelled solid gold cup, has banquets and masks and apparently fountains in the garden that spurted wine and beer rather than water. All of these entertainments for both the people of the town and the king and, of course, his vast entourage that turned up. The problem was that King James enjoyed this so much he kept turning up. And he visited Hinchinbrook 15 times in his reign. And every time he did, he expected the same lavish entertainment. And of course, he didn't pay his own way, and it pretty much bankrupted the Cromwell family. And Sir Oliver was forced to sell Hinchinbrook in 1627 to the Montagues, who later become the Earls of Sandwich, and they owned Hinchinbrook House up until 1968. Nowadays, Hinchinbrook House is the sixth form centre of the local secondary school, and it's open at weekends, Sunday afternoons during July and August for tours.
But there's maybe a little lesson for all of us then. So if you're going to entertain guests, don't do it too well.
Yeah, possibly, and particularly not royalty who turn up with an entourage. So, Sir Oliver, interestingly, ended up living in Ramsey up the road from here. And interestingly, he was a royalist during the Civil War. So even the Cromwell family is split apart on which side to fight on.
So the story of the Civil War, or is it Civil Wars, quite complicated?
It is, yeah. Calling it the English Civil War is the biggest misnomer in British history. It's not English, it covers the whole of Britain and Ireland, and in fact there's fighting further afield on the continent and even in the American colonies. It's not one single war, it's multiple conflicts, from the Bishops' Wars in the 1630s to the main civil wars to the campaigns in Ireland and so on. And there's nothing civil about it whatever. It's the most brutal conflict in British history. It's reckoned around 8% of the British population died as a result, which is a greater proportion than any other conflict in our history. More people died in the civil wars of the 1640s than did in World War II in this country, and yet with a much smaller population. So as many people said, it was the world turned upside down.
So that's a complex story to tell, but you have a pretty good go at it in the museum.
Shall we wander inside? Yeah, let's wander inside and we'll talk a bit more about that.
Fantastic. So we're now inside the museum. It's quite a grand building.
It is. It's actually the oldest standing structure in Huntingdon. This is a medieval religious house, or originally was built as such. That wall, the end wall that faces out onto the square, the left-hand wall as we're looking at it here, date to about 1160 to 1180. The building behind me, the wall over there, is 14th century, and this side is 16th century. And originally it was part of a much larger complex of buildings, a house of Augustinian canons, that were providing accommodation for people coming through Huntingdon on the Great North Road. Of course, that was the main artery of the country between London, obviously as the capital of the country, and York as the capital of the north. Nowadays you could drive from London to York by car in about 5 or 6 hours. That would have been a 5 or 6 day journey back in the Middle Ages. So of course people needed places to stay, and that's really what Huntingdon developed really as one long street with businesses and shops and taverns and inns that were servicing the needs of travellers. This building was basically effectively budget accommodation for pilgrims and so on. So if you couldn't afford a room in one of the taverns, you could get a bed for the night here with the monks. Think of it as a medieval religious travel lodge, if you like.
Nice. Then did it become a school, is that right?
Yeah, so obviously with the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century with Henry VIII, that's when most of the building is demolished, but this bit was retained. And we know by 1565 it's being used as the Huntingdon Free School. So this is a school for about 30 boys at any one time, which sounds tiny, but bear in mind it was middle-class boys only, and we're in an age when the population is much smaller than today. You know, as a good-sized county town, Huntingdon had a population of maybe 1,200 people, so everywhere was much smaller then. So you'd have 30 boys aged between 10 and 16 who would be here 6 days a week, getting an education, a classical education, including lessons in Latin mostly, that would equip them then to be able to go on to university at Oxford or Cambridge. And in the 1600s, 2 of the boys who studied here went on to become very famous. First, of course, obviously, was Oliver Cromwell himself, who was born here and lived here, as I say, for half his life. The other was Samuel Pepys, the noted diarist. So Pepys came here in 1643. He was about 10 years of age. He'd been sent here by his parents because of the fears that London was going to be stormed during the Civil War by the Royalists. There was also an outbreak of plague in the capital. Plague seems to have followed Sam round all his life. So he was sent here for about 18 months, almost like a 17th century evacuee, to live with his uncle in Brampton. And we know he got a place here thanks to his cousin, Edward Montague, the local lord of the manor. He does describe later in life in his diaries going to school here in Huntingdon. He did later inherit the house in Brampton and was a frequent visitor to the town, so you'll find Huntingdon quite often in Pepys's diaries, usually referring to the quality of the pubs, which tells you a lot about Samuel Pepys.
Or maybe the pubs.
Yeah, or possibly both, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it remained property of the grammar school until the 1950s. We know during the war it was being used as a schoolroom for evacuees who were sent to Huntingdon from the London Blitz. But, yeah, 1958, there was an exhibition held in Huntingdon Town Hall to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Cromwell's death. And they borrowed items from many national collections, a lot of which would never be let out today. And the exhibition proved to be so successful, there was a campaign to create a permanent museum here. So we were opened in October 1962, funnily enough in the same week as the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, so I'm not quite sure we were front page news against the threat of nuclear annihilation. And we've been here ever since. We've been originally run by the county. We became an independent charity, an independent museum back in 2016.
And so walking into the museum, we're I almost say confronted, but we've suddenly got a lot of very beautiful portraits in front of us.
Yes. So, I mean, it is the best collection in the world of artefacts relating to Cromwell and his life and times. And our job is to try and tell that story, warts and all. He's a complex and controversial character, but he's obviously one of the most significant figures in British history. And we're very privileged. We have this amazing collection of artefacts, most of which belong to the museum, but some are on loan from the Cromwell family and other national collections. And so, yes, all the paintings you see here are original. So these ones here relate to Cromwell's early life. So we know he's born at the top end of the High Street in 1599. The oak beam over to my left here is the only surviving bit of the house he would have known. It was demolished in the early 1800s and replaced by a Regency villa, which is nowadays a nursing home. Yeah, these are portraits of various people associated with Cromwell's early life. So his uncle, who we referred to outside, Sir Oliver, who owned in Hinchinbrook in his more affluent younger days, and then after he'd blown the family fortune as an old man down there. Cromwell's mother in the case just here. Above it, his uncle who left him property in Ely, including the house that still stands there today, and a portrait of Cromwell's wife as a young woman.
Yeah. And we've got some texts as well.
Yeah, so property deeds relating and items here relating to Cromwell's early life. So a book written by Cromwell's schoolmaster, Thomas Beard, who was the school teacher here. We actually know very little about Cromwell's early life. There's all sorts of legends, one of which you can see in the Ladybird book just here. Many people of a certain age will remember Ladybird books.
Yes, actually, I have to say, yes, I do have that book.
Yes, I grew up with it. So, it tells all sorts of lovely stories about Cromwell's childhood, about how he was kidnapped by his uncle's pet monkey and carried up onto the roof of Hinchinbrook House, or he had a fight with the future Charles I when they were both boys in the grounds of Hinchinbrook. They're lovely stories, but they're almost certainly not true. They were made up in the 18th century when there's the beginnings of the popular interest in Cromwell, but there was realised then there was very little known about his early life. So basically people made stuff up.
So I've got to scrub what I thought I knew about him and perhaps need to start again. And actually, you kind of helping him, as well as some of the exhibits, the paintings, and you've got some costumes. You've also got something for children as well. Well, I say for children, you've got something...
It's used just as much by adults, yeah. So this is a way of explaining to people why the Civil War happened in a simple, easily understandable, and also very small space. Got this sort of almost like an animation of a PowerPoint here that shows the different stages of how the Civil War came about and why there was this brutal conflict in the 17th century.
Yeah, so it's in like a comic book style. And again, it's just making this complex period of history accessible and understandable, so then you can then ask the next question on.
Exactly, yeah. So this is basically explaining the background to obviously King Charles I and his various religious policies and personal issues and his views in terms of taxation and his relationship with Parliament, all of which escalates things to the point whereby in 1642 this brutal conflict spreads right across the whole of Britain and Ireland, drags on for the next decade and causes devastation.
And to get a clear idea of how it was prosecuted, what they used to fight with, we've got some pretty clear examples here.
Yeah, so there's some lovely examples here of some of the arms and armour of the period. Some of these items very kindly on long-term loan to us from the Royal Armouries in Leeds, which has the best collection in the world of Civil War arms and armour. These are sort of the pikeman and musketeer, the cavalryman's equipment of the period, sort of citizen soldiers who went to war in this brutal conflict.
And what they would have worn as well.
Some of the clothing here, the soft clothing, is replica, purely on the basis that fabric doesn't very often survive from this period, but all the leather, the arms and armour and everything else here is all original. Just next to you here, there's items relating to Cromwell himself's story, including the two swords in here which we know belong to him. Around the world there's various swords which reputedly belong to Cromwell. There's 4 in the world that can actually be proved to have belonged to him. We have 3 of them. The one on the right has indications in the blade that it's been used. It's got marks in the blade, it's got his initials etched into it. And the one on the left, which actually appears in a painting. So again, it's pretty good evidence that he genuinely owned these. And it's because of the Civil War he rises to significance. As I say, he was nothing that special earlier on in his life. He goes to university in Cambridge. We know he basically comes back here when he's 17. He doesn't graduate because his father dies and he's responsible for taking on the family business of renting out properties, looking after his mum and 6 sisters. He marries in 1620, has a very devoted relationship with his wife Elizabeth. They have 9 children, one of whom dies as a baby and 2 who die quite young as teenagers, effectively. And then in 1631, he leaves Huntingdon and moves to St Ives, partly because he's having financial problems. He's downwardly mobile, as we might say. He was reduced to being a tenant farmer. Partly because he's having mental health issues. He's diagnosed with what they call melancholia, what today we call depression, which he has periodic bouts of through the rest of his life. And partly because there is a big political argument in Huntingdon over a new charter, which he finds himself on the wrong side of. So he lives in St Ives for about 5 years, which is arguably the most miserable period of his life, but also a very significant one because going through the difficult period of his life that he did, he finds his faith. And he becomes deeply religious, becomes effectively a born-again Puritan.
In front of us, we have a series of pamphlets.
Yeah, there's lots of pamphlets you'll see on display here. This is a sort of a period where the printing press becomes a weapon in its own right. Printing is now a relatively inexpensive form of technology. And also by now, as well in the 1640s, more and more people have learnt to read and write, partly because of the growth of grammar schools, like the one in this building, but also people were teaching themselves to read and write at home because they found it increasingly useful for business, and more particularly since the Reformation, the Bible was now in English, and with the printing press was affordable. So in a deeply religious age, more and more people wanted to be able to read the Bible for themselves and understand the Word of God as they saw it in their own right. So probably one in three people could read and write. So if you couldn't read and write yourself, you knew somebody else who could. So political propaganda becomes hugely important during the Civil War, and also by the spread of radical ideas. So some of the pamphlets in this case are from a group of individuals called the Levellers, who in the wake of the Civil War started to propose the very radical idea that all men should have the vote. And that's the first time in British history that is proposed. It's a radical concept for the 1640s, although at no point did anybody suggest, unfortunately, that women should have the vote.
Just as a aside from that, around this same time that these sorts of pamphlets are being produced, last time I came here, you had a book on witchcraft, and Matthew Hopkins, and that's so contemporary to the Civil War going on. We see a spread of ideas partly through pamphlets.
Yes, in fact, Hopkins himself came here to Huntingdon in 1646, and it's Huntingdon's dirty little secret, in a way, really, that we are arguably the witch trial capital of England. We had not one but three different sets of witch trials here. So in 1593, ladies called Alice Samuel, her husband and daughter, were accused of witchcraft in the nearby village of Warboys, the famous witches of Warboys, probably the most notorious witchcraft case of the Elizabethan period. And they were brought here to Huntingdon, tried and found guilty of witchcraft and executed on Mill Common, a couple of streets from here. Then in 1646, Matthew Hopkins, the infamous witchfinder general, came here to Huntingdon, and 9 people were accused of witchcraft, 6 women and 3 men. Of those 4, 3 of the women, 1 of the men were found guilty and convicted and again hanged on Mill Common. And then there's allegedly a case in 1716, which we can't prove. The only evidence we have for it is a rather scurrilous newspaper. But if true, it would be the last person to be executed for witchcraft in England, a lady called Mary Hicks and her 9-year-old daughter. So, yes, there is this sort of grim set of cases here, and those people were already tried in the old Assize Court, which stood on the site of where the town hall is today.
So, now, the history of the civil wars, the not English but British civil wars, or global civil wars, arguably, some of this is pretty grim stuff. But you do try and make this accessible for children.
Yes, absolutely the case. We do lots of educational visits here, and we've got here a box of items, all replicas, which people can try on. So both kids and big kids as well, shall we say, love trying on some of the helmets and the replica hats and the armour and replica costumes here. But it also, as well as being a bit of fun and a great photo opportunity, it's also a way of people understanding, the weight of this sort of stuff and how it works and so on. So with the replica musket here, you only understand it by picking it up, and there's the little video around the other side, which we've got a video there of a modern reenactor showing how this sort of thing is loaded and fired.
So you can actually pick up a musket.
Yeah.
It's not loaded, and it's got the wick, and you can really get a feel for what this would have been like. And you've got those, what they call lobster helmets, is that right?
Yeah, lobster pot helmets, which are the Victorian collector's name for them, because if you look at the back of the head, the actual sort of neck guard looks rather like a lobster's tail. So Cromwell rises to significance because of the Civil War, although he's inherited properties in Ely in 1636, he's living there. He's a middling sort gentleman, he's nothing very significant. He's asked to stand as an MP for the second time in his life. He'd been briefly MP for Huntingdon back here a decade beforehand. And he becomes MP for Cambridge, and he sits in the Parliament that's discussing Charles I's policies, becomes attached to the party that's opposed to them. In 1642, when the Civil War breaks out, he gets a commission as a captain of cavalry. He's only in charge of 60 men, and he comes back to Huntingdon to raise and recruit those soldiers. He's 43 years old. He's knocking on a bit for the 17th century. He's never picked up a sword in his life before, and yet to everybody's surprise, not least his own, he turns out to be good at it. He's good with people. He's good with horses. He's bred horses for much of his life, so it makes him a good cavalryman. He's decisive. He's personally brave and leads his soldiers from the front. He's very well organised. He's very good at logistics. realises that if he can't pay his soldiers or feed them, they're no use to anybody. And we know, obviously, from modern conflicts like Ukraine, that's important. So because of his military prowess, he then gets promoted and becomes more significant. And then because of that success, he then starts to be listened to in Parliament, so he becomes more politically successful as well. So that's how he rises to prominence.
Yeah, we've got a series of busts of him here, and again, the phrase underneath, warts and all, which is probably what he's most famous for.
Yes, and in fact, there's the warts and all portrait.
Yeah.
So there's one of about half a dozen copies that were all produced at the time. This is the famous painting by Peter Lely, which allegedly, when Cromwell went to sit for the painting, he supposedly told Lely, who was already well known for romanticising his subjects, "I require you to use the best of your talents. Paint me as I am, pimples, warts and everything. Otherwise I shall not pay you a farthing from the painting." And from this we derive the phrase warts and all. However, there's a small problem with this. The earliest source we have for this quote is over 100 years after Cromwell's death. So there's a number of things we often quote or ascribe to Cromwell that actually he probably didn't say at all. Another one like trusting God and keep your powder dry. We still talk about keeping your powder dry today. Well, actually, that's invented by a rather mad Victorian poet who put it into Cromwell's mouth. So, as always with these things, always look for the evidence from the time. But there's some interesting paintings just here which are all from the time, these three particularly. The one on the right there of him on horseback, which is rather a nice painting. He's wearing a grey silk velvet suit there, which we know he actually owned in real life, and wore to his daughter's Francis's wedding in 1657, where apparently got quite drunk at the wedding reception, danced with all the ladies, took part in the amateur dramatics, and then ran around playing practical jokes on his new son-in-law. It's not quite the image we have of him, but then the image we have of him as this dour, Puritan killjoy, all dressed in black, is really a creation of the Victorians and actually doesn't really accord with the contemporary accounts of the people who met Cromwell or knew him, or indeed with the writings of the man himself, who's a far more complex character. I think he's neither a hero or villain. I think he's a fascinating character, and I think he's a different, not so much black and white, but shades of grey, and different shades of grey at different times in his life. So some things we would find today actually quite admirable about him, like his policies on religious toleration were hugely advanced for their time, allowing people to worship as they wanted to, including behind closed doors Catholics, but also allowing the nonconformist groups, the Baptists and the Quakers, owe their origins to Cromwell. He allowed the Jewish community to resettle in England for the first time in over 300 years. So for that, he was hugely advanced. Things like constitutional government, so the idea of a written constitution was introduced for the first time under Cromwell. And a lot of the ideas of the constitution that was brought in at that time, which we have an original copy on display here, were basically the idea of separation of powers between different branches of government, are things that you would find familiar from the American Constitution now. On the other hand, people have lambasted him as a king killer, a regicide, a man who was involved with the trial and execution of Charles I. Nowadays, people are a bit more relaxed about that. A lot of people think Charles I kind of had it coming. And more particularly, of course, the biggest controversy, of course, has been his infamous campaign in Ireland in 1649, for which he's reviled in Ireland today. And I think, you can quite clearly say that with certain things like the storming of Drogheda, for example, there is a clear case there that, if not in terms of a court of law, certainly morally speaking, he was guilty of war crimes.
Yes. You've got something rather arresting in one of these cabinets.
The death masks we're looking at here, yeah. So again, representations of Cromwell's face. So yes, he dies of natural causes in September 1658, and they take a wax impression of his face the day after his death. They produce the death mask, and there's multiple copies of this produced, like the one on the left here. One on the right is a Victorian copy. The Victorians who revered Cromwell produced commercial death masks. People had them on their walls or their mantelpieces. But that was used with a funeral effigy at Cromwell's state funeral in November 1658. Of course, whilst he was buried with a full state funeral in Westminster Abbey, he didn't lie there for long. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II wanted payback against any of those involved with the trial and execution of his father. So the regicides, as they're called, are hunted down. 16 of them are executed very grisly by being hung, drawn and quartered. Cromwell and two others who are already dead, their corpses are exhumed, taken to Tyburn and London and ceremonially executed. They're hung for 8 hours before being cut down, and Cromwell's head is hacked off and stuck on a spike outside the Palace of Westminster. His body almost certainly was thrown into the communal burial pit alongside. So today his body probably lies under the end of Oxford Street near Marble Arch, which is where Tyburn stood. The head, however, went on a whole series of adventures because the spike it was on snapped off after being this mummified head on display for about 20 years. It snapped off in a storm in about 1686. It was picked up by a soldier on guard duty who decided to keep it as a souvenir but was frightened of being caught with it. So he sewed it up into a leather sack, stuffed it up his chimney, and then only confessed what he'd done to his daughter on his deathbed a few years later. She took down this rather smoked, mummified head and sold it to a Swiss collector called Claudius Dupuy, who then exhibited it in a private museum in London and made a lot of money showing it off to people. It passed through various hands until 1814, when it was sold to a family called Wilkinson, who kept it in a wooden box on their mantelpiece and used to get it out and show it to people at dinner parties. And we've got a photograph just here on the panel of Canon Wilkinson holding the head in 1935. That was the year they had it scientifically tested by two very sceptical forensic scientists who tried all sorts of tests. They had it x-rayed, photographed. They concluded that it genuinely was Cromwell's head. And eventually the head was given by Dr. Wilkinson in 1960 to Sidney College in Cambridge, which is where Cromwell went to university. And it was then interred in the chapel there, in an unmarked spot, although there is a plaque on the wall that says near this spot is buried the head of Oliver Cromwell. I'm told by Nick, the college archivist, that when they buried it there in 1960, they decided to put it in an airtight container to help preserve it for any future scientific inquiry. And unfortunately, the only airtight container they could find that was large enough to accommodate the head, the spike, and the wooden box it came in was an old-fashioned galvanised catering tin of biscuits. So yes, Cromwell's head is buried in a biscuit tin. You couldn't make it up.
So in terms of visiting this place and learning more, what are your opening hours?
So we're open Tuesdays to Sundays, 10 till 4 during the summer, 10 till 3:30 in the winter months. We're open bank holiday Mondays as well. Admission is free of charge. We are an independent charity, so we welcome and indeed encourage donations. My volunteers have a running joke that it's free to get in and a £5 to get out. So you will get taught to death by them. And there's some amazing artefacts, so we can see here with some of these. So things like Cromwell's medical chest, for example, which contains these beautiful silver gilt pots that would have originally contained ingredients for medicines. The letter at the back, which is in his hand, in which he's writing in 1652, actually talking about one of his depressive episodes. And he's telling a friend of his that he feels very isolated, very alone, doesn't know who he can unburden himself to, feels like all his friends are gone from him, and asking this friend to pray for him. It's language that seems very familiar today. We also have here items related to his time as Lord Protector. So this beautiful cabinet here, which is decorated with a style of kind of mosaic work known as pietra dure. And this is an Italian cabinet, a Florentine chest, which was gifted to Cromwell as a diplomatic gift by the Medici family in 1656.
It's a pomade chest.
A pomade chest. Pomade is basically a posh name for soap.
Oh.
So inside are about 40 little glass pots, each of which is covered with a beautifully embroidered cap. Every now and again we get a couple out to show people because they are as fresh as the day they were made, because they were rarely exposed to light. And originally those pots would have contained soap. So this is like getting an expensive gift basket from Lush or Fortnum & Mason's. And in fact, some of the fragments of soap survived and were scientifically tested some years ago. They found that it was a basis of olive oil and that some of it was scented with oranges. Oh. So a lovely image of Mrs. Cromwell, I suspect, washing herself in orange-scented soap.
And a rather fetching hat.
The hat is an incredible survival. So that's wool felt. So it's amazing it's survived at all since the 1640s. Again, kindly on loan to us from the Cromwell family. It's genuinely a mid-17th century gentleman's hat. It's the right type of hat, right type of period. Legend has it that Cromwell wore it when he dismissed Parliament in April 1653, famously telling them, "You've sat too long upon this place for any good you have done lately. It is time for you to depart. In the name of God, go." Actually, that's not what he said at all. He told the MPs that gold was their god and they had no more religion than his horse. But the sanitised quote sounds better.
And towards the end of his days, would it be fair to say he Was it his melancholy taking him, or just the pressures of the job?
It's a combination of things, really. So, yes, I mean, he's Lord Protector, Head of State from December 1653 up until his death in September 1658. So for 5 years, he's Head of State. This sort of role, Lord Protector, is somewhere between a president and a monarch. A lot of people have said, he was king in all but name. And, of course, famously, he was twice offered the crown and rejected it on both occasions. He didn't want to become king. But yes, he dies in September 1658. He'd been suffering from a number of health issues. He'd been worn out and exhausted, I think, by everything that had happened. He'd been wounded a couple of times in the Civil War. We know that he was suffering through much of his life with what they called the ague, what today we call malaria, which was actually quite common in this region. Please be careful as you're walking along the Grey Twos.
Is that anything to do with being in the Fens, so his time in Ely?
Yeah, probably. So, being born and brought up in this area, in Fenland area, malarial fevers were a common problem right into the 19th century because it was associated with the Fens, obviously marshland, which attracted malarial mosquitoes. So lots of people suffered from it, and you find that one of the things grown in the Fens traditionally were poppies, so producing opiates, which could help with the alleviation of that. So, we know he was suffering from a bout of the ague. He was battling with kidney stones. And the thing that really polished him off more than anything else is just above the case here, the lady in the blue dress. That's his favourite daughter, Elizabeth. And she died in August 1658. She was only 29, and she died of cancer. And her death seems to have absolutely devastated him. He sort of almost nursed her through the last few weeks of her life. And he seems to have given up. And he was dead 3 weeks later. George Fox, who was the founder of the Quaker movement, met Cromwell while he was out on one of his better days, and Fox, who was not the most tactful man, looked at him and said, "Oliver, you look like a dead man walking." So, yes, he died of natural causes.
So it's an absolutely fascinating museum. It's so much in such a tight space. So when you get your new places, fingers crossed, you are getting them, right?
Yeah.
So when's that going to open for a start?
So we're hoping that will open sometime in 2030. So we've acquired the building. Yeah. We're now working on the architects and designs and plans, and then we need to do some fundraising in order to then convert that into a museum and fit it out. So that'll be the project for the next 4 to 5 years. And yes, it will be as object rich as this. We give us a little bit more room to breathe, but of course we have a lot more stuff in storage. We can't display at the moment. And one of the things people love about this museum is the fact that they come in here and there is, even though it's a very small space, there is so much to see.
So making a little donation wouldn't be a bad thing to do to get that new place up and running. And one of the ways you can do it as well is buying one of your books, so something to read on the rest of your walk.
Yes, absolutely. So a whole range of books and souvenirs inside here. We even have our own Lego here. We actually have, so we're the only place in the world that sells a Lego Oliver Cromwell. We have that unique to us, Lego Cromwell, and of course, to be fair, a Lego Charles I as well. So we have both of them here, and a Lego Samuel Pepys. So those are unique to us, and the only place you can get those from.
And if you want a hat, there are Monmouth caps.
Monmouth caps, which are a knitted woolen cap, which are ideal for if you're going a long walk on the Grey Twos and keeping your head warm, which are from original late 16th, early 17th century design and hand knitted by several of our volunteers.
And at the moment it's September, but Christmas isn't that far off.
Yeah, absolutely. And if, of course, you are looking for that unusual Christmas gift, not only can you buy it here in the museum, but if you look at our website, cromwellmuseum.org, you'll see we have an online shop, so you can order from the comfort of your own home.
You can send a card as well.
Oh, yes, and our Christmas is cancelled Christmas cards.
Yeah. So he's famous for saying Christmas is cancelled, but...
There was a Christmas ban, but actually, in reality, Cromwell himself had no involvement with it. So when the ban was passed in 1647, Cromwell was away at the war at the time. We don't actually know what he thought about Christmas at all. He doesn't refer to it at all in any of his voluminous letters or speeches. And also, the Christmas ban, even though it was passed, was wildly ineffective. Most people seem to have ignored it. And in 1656, Parliament met on Christmas Day because the MPs regarded it as being a normal working day, and they all sat there and whinged about the fact that all the shops were shut when they were supposed to be open as normal, and that none of them had a wink of sleep the night before because they'd all been kept awake by the neighbours' Christmas parties.
Well, I think that says it all. Okay, so plenty of myths to bust, plenty of things to find out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this.
You are very welcome, and please do come and see us.